On March 30th, 1981, Ronald Reagan was nearly killed when he was shot outside the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. The official story was that a 25-year-old man named John Hinckley Jr. was to blame. It was claimed Hinckley was crazy, mentally disturbed, a lone nut who'd attempted to kill the president all on his own. But there are a ton of really weird and mysterious things about this assassination. A lot of things just really don't add up or make any sense at all. So here are 10 of the strangest things about the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. By far, the strangest thing about the Reagan assassination attempt is that the family of assassin John Hinckley and the family of Vice President George Bush were very close. Unbelievably, the day after the assassination, the brother of John Hinckley was even scheduled to have dinner with Neil Bush, Vice President Bush's son. And this is just incredible, astounding, absolutely mind-blowing that the brother of the man who shot the president was going to have dinner with the vice president's son the very night after the assassination. It was also reported that the Hinckleys were major donors to George Bush's 1980 presidential campaign, and that the families had known each other for a while. They were both rich Texas oil families. The Hinckleys established an oil and gas company named Vanderbilt Energy in Dallas in 1970, and the Bush family made billions through their Texas oil companies. It was even rumored that Bush had bailed out the Hinckleys in the 1970s when Vanderbilt Energy was about to go under. Obviously, if Reagan was killed, George Bush would have become president, and the fact that there were all these links between his family and the family of the assassin led many to believe that Bush had been involved in the assassination attempt in some way. Now, if Vice President Bush was involved, it would have been the story of the century, the biggest story of all time, but this got buried very quickly. A day after these links were reported, the Bushes claimed they actually hadn't received any money from the Hinckleys, and Neil Bush claimed he barely knew Scott Hinckley, despite their scheduled dinner date. The press pretty much bought this explanation hook, line, and sinker. The connection was written off as a coincidence, nothing more than that, and no one really investigated or researched or followed up on this insanely weird connection. In the years since, this has been mostly ignored. This CNN article about John Hinckley Jr. doesn't even mention that his brother and Neil Bush were having dinner together the night after the assassination. Even the massive Wikipedia page on Reagan's attempted assassination doesn't mention anything about the Hinckley-Bush connections or the scheduled dinner date. Not a single mention. And it's just amazing how this really bizarre connection has been ignored and forgotten about and buried over the years. Another bizarre coincidence is that the Hinckleys oil company Vanderbilt Energy was being investigated for fraud at the time. On the morning of the assassination, Scott Hinckley had met with 3 representatives from the U.S. Department of Energy who had found pricing violations on crude oil sold by the company. They told Hinckley that the government was considering a penalty of $2 million, a massive fine that could have bankrupted the company. And this meeting ended an hour before John Hinckley Jr. shot President Reagan. This investigation ended up being dropped and Vanderbilt Energy was never fined, and it's definitely very strange that this investigation was happening right before the assassination. Many believe it could have been used as leverage or a threat to get the Hinckleys involved in the assassination plot. Caspar Weinberger was Reagan's Secretary of Defense, and in his biography he mentioned something really amazing. He wrote that there was a simulated FEMA exercise about the presidential succession plan scheduled for the day after Reagan was shot with the title 9 Lives. And after Reagan was shot, it was agreed that the exercise should be canceled. And maybe this is just another one of those convenient coincidences. But if it is, it's a heck of a coincidence that FEMA scheduled an exercise about the presidential succession plan for the exact day after the president was nearly killed. John Hinckley Sr. had a very interesting background. He was the president and founder of Vanderbilt Energy, but he also had served as board president for an organization named World Vision, which is a ministry group that does missionary work around the world, but the organization is pretty notorious for its links to the CIA and military intelligence. In Vietnam, the U.S. Army used World Vision ministers to gather information for them, and it was reported that World Vision had received, quote, millions of dollars from the U.S. government. Basically, the CIA and military were using World Vision employees for missions because it was much easier and less suspicious than smuggling their own operatives into foreign countries. As the president of World Vision's board, John Hinckley Sr. would have most likely known about these operations and maybe even been involved. It was also learned that Mark David Chapman, who murdered John Lennon months before the Reagan assassination attempt, worked for World Vision as well, which means that World Vision was very closely linked to the 2 most famous assassinations of the 1980s. And if World Vision was used as a front for the CIA, it's interesting to note that George Bush was head of the CIA before he became vice president. There were also a lot of strange facts about John Hinckley Jr. that emerged. In the fall of 1980, Hinckley Jr. was arrested at the Nashville airport with 3 guns and 50 rounds of ammunition on the day that President Jimmy Carter was visiting. Hinckley was also in Dayton, Ohio during a visit by President Carter, and there were rumors he was also spotted in Chicago during another Carter visit there. It appeared that a heavily armed Hinckley was stalking Carter around the country, and this was going on at the time Bush and Reagan were locked in a heated battle with Carter for the presidency. Hinckley was on some pretty heavy medication and had a long history of receiving psychiatric treatment, leading some to believe he was some sort of Manchurian candidate type assassin who'd been hypnotized as part of the government's MK Ultra brainwashing program. Which, by the way, isn't some rumor or conspiracy. It's been confirmed by many that MK Ultra existed and was used on quite a few people during this era. Right before the assassination attempt, Hinckley stayed at a hotel in Colorado for 2 weeks, and it was reported that, strangely, every day at noon he would walk out to a payphone and receive a phone call. Multiple residents and hotel employees reported seeing Hinckley waiting by payphones for calls, and it was never determined who was calling him or why he went to a payphone when there was a phone in his room. But the most logical explanation was that he was receiving some sort of instructions for the assassination from someone who didn't want to leave a trace of the calls. Hinckley also traveled extensively throughout the country in the years before the assassination, from California to Washington, back again, and everywhere in between. It was never really determined why he was traveling so much, or more importantly, how he financed these trips, since he had no real source of income. A week before the assassination attempt on Reagan, there was a very bizarre story that Bush himself had been the victim of an assassination attempt. And this is just a weird story. It began when a Washington, D.C. artist witnessed a murder outside her apartment. She ran outside to help, but the victim apparently died in her arms, and it turned out the victim was a Supreme Court librarian. Then, a couple weeks later, the same woman witnessed a car accident in the same location. Once again, she ran outside to help, and it just so happened that the same cop who responded to the murder weeks earlier was outside again. The officer told her that Vice President Bush has just been shot. Other people began to hear the same thing, and this rumor apparently spread like wildfire throughout Washington, D.C. It was investigated by police, the FBI spoke to Bush about it, and Bush was reportedly furious that the information had been leaked. Bush denied the entire thing, and it was written off as a rumor, but it's a really strange story, and it's even stranger that this shooting was reported only a week before the assassination attempt on Reagan. People have also wondered about this Supreme Court librarian who supposedly died in the arms of the woman who was told Bush had been shot. It's almost comical how bad your luck would have to be to have someone die in your arms one week and then get caught up in a rumored shooting of the vice president the very next week. And people have wondered if this librarian was maybe tied into everything. Maybe she was working on some sort of important case, but her identity has always remained a mystery. Another interesting note with George Bush is that on the day of Reagan's assassination attempt, Bush was in Texas dedicating a plaque at the Hotel Texas in Fort Worth. And this just happens to be the hotel where JFK stayed on the night before he was assassinated. And maybe this is yet another coincidence, but the fact that Bush was at this specific hotel the day Reagan was shot is definitely interesting timing. One of the really curious little facts about the Reagan administration is how deeply involved with astrology they were. A psychic named Joan Quigley told the Reagans she could have foreseen and possibly prevented the assassination attempt, and after this, she became the resident astrologist for the White House. In Quigley's biography, she says she was responsible for the timing of all press conferences, most speeches, the State of the Union addresses, the takeoffs and landings of Air Force One, and she even picked the time of Ronald Reagan's debate with Carter and the 2 debates with Walter Mondale. And this is just an interesting little side note to the assassination attempt that it's credited with the Reagans' obsession with astrology. Obviously, everyone's heard of the JFK magic bullet theory, but the bullet that hit Reagan was a bit of a magic bullet as well. It's been described as an unlikely hit and a 1 in a million shot. The official story is that Reagan was hit by a bullet that struck the side of the limo, ricocheted off it, passed through a small opening between the door and the car frame, and struck Reagan at the precise moment he was being thrown into the limo. You can see Hinckley with his gun here in this screenshot, and this is the small opening the bullet went through after ricocheting off the side of the limo. When you watch the replay, Reagan is shielded by the door and the Secret Service agent for nearly the entire time. There is maybe a millisecond where Reagan is actually exposed enough for the shot to travel the path it supposedly traveled and hit him. After passing through this narrow opening between the door, the bullet would have also had to avoid Reagan's arm and the Secret Service agent on top of him to hit him in the side of his ribcage. So I guess anything is technically possible, but it really would take a bit of a magic bullet to ricochet through this small opening and hit Reagan in the fraction of a second he was exposed. As with the JFK assassination, some claim there was a second shooter involved in the Reagan shooting. So Hinckley fired 6 shots from his .22 caliber gun in 1.7 seconds, which is pretty much instantaneous shooting. There would have been no time to hesitate or aim between shots. But some audio analyses indicated a 7th bullet could be heard, which would have meant there was a second shooter since Hinckley's gun only held 6 bullets. 4 people were shot that day, and one of the curious facts about the shooting was the large difference in the injuries sustained by those 4 people. 3 of the 4 sustained pretty minor injuries and recovered fully. Reagan even signed a piece of legislation the day after being shot in the chest. But James Brady, who was Reagan's Secretary of State and one of his closest allies, nearly had his head blown off, lost half his brain, and was paralyzed for life. His injuries were significantly worse than the other 3 victims, and some wondered if this was because Brady was actually hit by a second gunman firing a different caliber round. And the explanation given for Brady's injuries was interesting. It was said that Hinckley was firing devastator bullets that were designed to explode upon impact, but the bullet that hit Brady was the only one of the 6 to explode. Conveniently, the other 5 didn't explode, which is why no one else was injured severely. It's even rumored that this photo shows the second gunman right here on this overhang. And it honestly does look like a person. Here's a head, an arm, a torso, so it's definitely interesting, but this could obviously be nothing at all as well, maybe just some sort of reflection. In recap, there was so much weird stuff going on with the Reagan assassination. The JFK assassination is notorious for all the strange connections and coincidences and theories that surround it, but the Reagan shooting might be just as controversial. From the Hinckleys and the Bushes having a relationship, to the $2 million fine that Vanderbilt Energy was facing at the time of the shooting, to John Hinckley Sr.'s connection to World Vision, there are a whole lot of things here that just don't really seem to add up at all.